We love watching heroes run into fire, the danger, the chaos, the illusion of control. That's what action cinema promises, precision masquerading as madness. But behind the lens, that illusion often burns away. For every explosion choreographed to perfection, there's another one. Nobody planned an argument, an accident, a collapse. Actors broke bones, directors broke down, and entire productions teetered between triumph and disaster. Hollywood sells adrenaline. What it hides is exhaustion. The stories behind these movies weren't written by screenwriters, they were carved into people's lives, into careers that never recovered, into bodies that never healed. Some of these films became classics, others barely survived long enough to be finished, but all of them share one haunting truth. The real battle wasn't in the story, it was in the making of it. So let's go behind the explosions, beneath the stunts, and inside the chaos. These are 15 action films where the fight didn't end when the camera stopped rolling because the war was never fiction to begin with. Fact Hasson, Mad Max, Fury Road. The desert didn't need special effects, it devoured everything on its own. Mad Max. Fury Road looked like organized madness. Every frame, a storm, every stunt, a heartbeat away from disaster. But the true clash wasn't between cars or explosions, it was between its stars. Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron entered the Namibian desert as two professionals. They left it as two people who could barely stand each other. Hardy's unpredictable energy met Theron's rigid discipline, and soon, silence filled the gaps between scenes. Crew members described the atmosphere as radioactive. Hardy would show up late. Theron refused to speak. Their feud grew so intense that they had to shoot separately whenever possible. Director George Miller let the tension live, believing it gave the film its feral realism. He was right, but the cost was brutal. When it was all over, Hardy apologized. Theron accepted. The film won 6 Oscars, but the real victory was survival of two actors who hated each other just enough to make cinematic history. And if the desert seemed cruel, the next battlefield was man-made. Fact #2, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Some productions fall apart quietly. This one tore itself to pieces in public. The Island of Dr. Moreau began with ambition, a bizarre vision of science, madness, and mutation. But it quickly turned into one of Hollywood's most infamous implosions. Director Richard Stanley lost control before the first week ended. Fired and replaced by John Frankenheimer, he vanished into the jungle only to return days later disguised as one of the extras. Meanwhile, Marlon Brando showed up on set like a self-made god. He refused to follow the script, rewrote scenes mid-shot, and insisted on wearing an ice bucket as a hat. Val Kilmer, resentful and volatile, clashed with everyone, even the crew. No one knew who was in charge. Actors mutinied, tempers snapped. Frankenheimer simply tried to survive long enough to finish shooting. When it finally limped into theaters, the film was a disaster. But the chaos that birthed it became legendary proof that sometimes the monsters aren't on the screen. They're holding the camera. Fact #3. Apocalypse Now. There are films that take you into madness and films that drag you there. Apocalypse Now was never just a movie about war. It became one. Coppola led his cast deep into the Philippine jungle, where typhoons swallowed sets, disease swept through the crew, and sanity dissolved with the heat. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack mid-shoot. Brando arrived overweight, unread, and uncooperative. Every day was a gamble with lives, money, and reason. Coppola mortgaged his house, rewrote pages in panic, and watched his masterpiece consume itself. "We went insane," he later admitted, little by little. When the film finally emerged, it was called genius. But genius isn't free. The price was months of delirium, a broken cast, and a director who looked into the abyss and saw himself staring back. And yet, that abyss wasn't done claiming its victims. Fact #4, The Revenant. There's method acting, and then there's survival. When Alejandro G. Iñárritu set out to make The Revenant, he didn't want a film. He wanted an ordeal. No sound stages, no artificial light, just raw nature. And the people he'd drag through it, temperatures dropped to freezing. Crew members trudged through snow and ice for hours each day. Dozens quit. Equipment froze. Patience broke. Iñárritu's perfectionism turned the set into a purgatory where exhaustion was routine. Leonardo DiCaprio went all in, biting into raw bison liver. crawling through sub-zero rivers, sleeping inside animal carcasses. His Oscar campaign later celebrated it as dedication. The crew called it something else: madness. By the time they wrapped, half the original team had walked away. The rest carried frostbite and resentment as souvenirs. The film went on to win awards, but everyone who survived it agreed on one thing: the wilderness wasn't the hardest part. It was working for the man who tried to control it. Fact Route 5. Waterworld. It began as a vision of post-apocalyptic spectacle and nearly ended the studio that funded it. Waterworld was shot entirely on open water. It sounded epic on paper. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. A tropical storm destroyed the multi-million-dollar set. The budget exploded. The crew battled seasickness, sunburn, and despair. Kevin Costner, both star and producer, refused to compromise. He clashed daily with director Kevin Reynolds until their partnership sank completely. Reynolds walked out before editing was finished. Costner stayed because there was no one else left to steer the ship. The press mocked it mercilessly. The crew called it Drown World. Costner nearly drowned himself during one stunt when his safety rig failed. By the time the film reached theaters, it was already infamous, the most expensive production of its time. Critics laughed, audiences hesitated, but somehow, against all odds, it floated back as a cult hit years later. Still, for those who lived it, the word Waterworld didn't mean cinema. It meant survival at sea. Fact #6, Blade, Trinity. Some sets collapse from pressure, others rot from silence. By the time Blade, Trinity started filming, Wesley Snipes had checked out emotionally, professionally, completely. Once the confident face of the franchise, he now treated the crew like strangers and the director like an enemy. He stopped speaking to David S. Goyer altogether. Notes replaced conversations. Each one signed simply Blade. He isolated himself from co-stars, refused eye contact, and left the set whenever he pleased. Scenes had to be stitched together using body doubles and camera tricks. Ryan Reynolds later described the shoot as tense, hostile, surreal. At one point, a confrontation between Snipes and Goyer turned physical. After that, security stayed close. The atmosphere stayed toxic. The final film felt lifeless, its energy drained before the editing even began. Snipes walked away from the role that made him famous and never returned. Sometimes, the vampire doesn't drain blood, he drains the room. Fact Route 7. Die Hard. It was supposed to be a simple action flick, a contained thriller about a man in a tower. What it became was the blueprint for every modern action movie, and a production teetering on collapse. When Bruce Willis was cast, no one took him seriously. He was a comedian, not a hero. Studio executives hid his face on posters. Terrified audiences would laugh. Meanwhile, the script kept mutating, scenes rewritten on the spot, lines improvised just to keep momentum. Director John McTiernan fought to maintain coherence, while producers second-guessed every decision. Willis was exhausted, filming Moonlighting by day and Die Hard by night, running on adrenaline and 3 hours of sleep. Then came the stunt accident. A charge detonated too close, damaging his hearing for life. He kept filming anyway. The chaos bled into the story, a man in over his head, surviving by instinct. When the film premiered, it felt authentic because it was. The sweat, the confusion, the panic, none of it was just acting. Sometimes, exhaustion is the most honest performance of all. Fact 8. Titanics. Every movie has breaking points. Titanic had hundreds. James Cameron built his ocean on land, a massive tank on the Mexican coast. The shoot was endless, the water freezing, the morale sinking. The word hell was whispered daily. Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Someone laced the crew's lobster chowder with PCP. Over 60 people were hospitalized. Some screamed, some laughed uncontrollably. Cameron vomited and bled from his eyes. No one was ever caught. Still, production pushed forward. Kate Winslet chipped a bone during a stunt. DiCaprio turned blue from hypothermia. Extras fainted. Crew members quit. Cameron shouted through a megaphone until his voice vanished. The schedule shattered. The budget tripled. Reporters called it Cameron's curse. When the film finally opened, it silenced everyone, not just with its beauty, but with the knowledge that it had nearly destroyed those who made it. Titanic wasn't a story about tragedy, it was one. Fact #9. The Shining. Perfection can be crueler than horror. Stanley Kubrick didn't direct The Shining, he dissected it frame by frame, take by take, until the life drained out of everyone involved. Shelley Duvall, cast as Wendy, endured the worst. Kubrick isolated her, berated her, and demanded retake after retake, 127 for one scene. Her hair fell out from stress. She cried daily. Her terror in the movie is real. Jack Nicholson fared no better. Kubrick kept the set freezing cold, deliberately unsettling him, feeding him nothing but cheese sandwiches to maintain irritation. The crew was forbidden to comfort Duvall. Kubrick wanted her truly broken, and he got what he wanted. When the movie finally wrapped, she collapsed emotionally, retreating from the industry for decades. Kubrick's masterpiece became legendary, but it was built from someone else's suffering. On screen, we see fear. Off screen, we see cruelty mistaken for genius. Fact Hasson 0, Troy. Some sets burn with ambition, others bleed from pride. Troy was meant to be myth reborn, a colossal retelling of the Trojan War, with Brad Pitt as Achilles, the flawless warrior. But behind the gold armor and polished spectacle, egos clashed harder than swords. Pitt and director Wolfgang Petersen saw two different films. Petersen wanted grandeur, Pitt wanted restraint. The result was constant friction, rehearsals that turned into arguments, and a silence that grew heavy enough to split the crew. Then irony struck. Pitt tore his Achilles tendon while training. Production halted for weeks. Eric Bana broke his thumb in a duel. Even the gods, it seemed, were mocking them. Under the scorching sun, the set became a field of frustration. When it was finally done, Pitt admitted he'd taken the role for obligation, not passion. His eyes on screen cold, distant, told the truth before he ever did. In the myth, Achilles was undone by one weakness. In Hollywood, that weakness is pride. Fact Hassono. RoboCop. He was half man, half machine, and entirely miserable. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop wasn't just science fiction, it was endurance. Peter Weller spent hours each morning being welded into a suit of fiberglass and metal that weighed nearly 40 kilos. Once inside, he could barely move or breathe. The heat was unbearable. Every take felt like suffocation. Weller trained with a mime coach to perfect the robotic movements, but once he wore the suit, everything changed. His rhythm was gone. His patience followed. Verhoeven pushed harder, shouting from behind the camera, demanding control, precision, more pain, more realism. Weller snapped, walking off, set in rage, but he came back, because the character demanded suffering, and he had plenty to give. The stiffness, the slow turns, the cold detachment, all born from exhaustion. And that exhaustion became iconic. When audiences saw RoboCop, they saw a symbol. When Weller saw it, he saw a reminder of what it cost to be that symbol. Fact Hasontu, Heaven's Gate. Every director dreams of freedom until it consumes them. After The Deer Hunter, Michael Cimino was Hollywood's golden boy. For Heaven's Gate, the studio gave him everything he asked for. He took it all, and then some. He tore down sets because the light wasn't spiritual enough. He made extras march for hours just to cross a background frame. He spent days waiting for the perfect cloud. No one dared question him, not until it was too late. The budget ballooned from $11 million to $44 million. The shoot stretched on for months. The crew called it a slow-motion catastrophe. Executives begged him to stop. He didn't listen. When the film finally premiered, it was an unmitigated disaster. Critics tore it apart. Audiences fled. United Artists collapsed soon after. Cimino's career never recovered. It was meant to be a masterpiece. It became a monument to excess, a reminder that sometimes creative control is just another kind of ruin. Fact Hasson 3. Mission Impossible 2. It looked like a collaboration between icons. It felt like a duel no one could win. When John Woo joined Mission Impossible 2, he brought his signature elegance doves, gun ballet, and controlled chaos. But Tom Cruise wasn't looking for collaboration, he was looking for command. Woo wanted poetry in motion. Cruise wanted dominance in every frame. Scenes were shot twice, one for Woo's vision, one for Cruise's. In the editing room, their creative tug-of-war left editors working around two different movies. Off camera, Cruise's obsession with realism terrified the crew. He climbed cliffs without ropes, performed stunts that defied reason, and brushed off studio warnings with a grin. By the end, Woo was drained. "I had no control," he later admitted. The film was a hit, fast, loud, profitable, but hollow to those who'd lived it. For Woo, it wasn't Mission Impossible, it was Mission Survive Tom Cruise. Fact Hasson 4. The Crow. Fiction can't protect you when fate decides to finish the story. Brandon Lee was stepping out of his father's shadow. The Crow was meant to make him a star, a tragic hero drenched in vengeance and beauty. But tragedy didn't wait for the premiere. During a late-night shoot, a gun meant to fire blanks released a real projectile, a fragment lodged from an earlier dummy round. The shot pierced Lee's abdomen. He was gone before the camera stopped rolling. The production froze. Crew members wept. Investigators descended. And through it all, an eerie sense of inevitability lingered, as if the story had already chosen its ending. But the chaos had begun long before. Accidents, electrical fires, injuries, the set felt cursed. Some whispered about the Lee family fate. Others blamed negligence. The studio decided to finish the film, using body doubles and CGI to complete what was left. When it was finally released, audiences called it haunting. They were right, because what they were watching wasn't fiction, it was loss, preserved forever on film. Fact Hasson 5. The Exorcist. When a director believes the end justifies the means, everyone else pays the price. William Friedkin didn't just direct The Exorcist, he unleashed it. Determined to capture real fear, he turned the set into a psychological experiment. He fired guns without warning to jolt reactions. He slapped actors. He pulled harnesses too hard, leaving Ellen Burstyn with a spinal injury that never healed. Linda Blair, only 12, was thrown into freezing conditions and bound so tight she could barely breathe. Accidents piled up. A fire destroyed the set. Crew members were injured, and 9 people connected to the production died before release. The media called it cursed. Friedkin called it commitment. When the film premiered, audiences fainted and screamed. The church condemned it, but Friedkin smiled because he'd achieved what he wanted, fear that felt real. The irony? It was real. Every bruise, every scream, every ghost that lingered long after. Some movies are performed. This one was endured. Bonus fact: Resident Evil, the final chapter. For most films, danger is a performance. For this one, it was real. During the production of Resident Evil, the final chapter, stunt performer Olivia Jackson rode a motorcycle straight toward a camera crane, a shot rehearsed, timed, safe on paper. But that day, the crane didn't move. The impact shattered her body. Bones splintered, her face was crushed. She was left in a coma for weeks. When she woke, her arm was gone, her spine broken, her life as a performer over. The crew mourned, but production continued. Weeks later, another accident killed a technician. The studio called it unfortunate. Insurance called it unforeseeable. Jackson called it what it was: neglect. She sued the producers and won. But there's no victory in survival when the price is everything you are. The film made hundreds of millions. Her name flashed for a moment in the credits, then disappeared into darkness. It's easy to celebrate the spectacle of risk when the people behind it are invisible. But on this set, the real horror wasn't undead, it was indifference. We remember the explosions, the stunts, the heroes walking through fire. But the real fire was never on screen. It burned behind it in the exhaustion, the pain, and the silence no one filmed. Every story here was built on sacrifice. Some intentional, some unforgivable. And yet, we keep watching, drawn to the illusion of control inside chaos. So here's the question that lingers after the credits fade. How much suffering is too much for a masterpiece? And when does dedication become a wound we stop pretending is art? Tell us what you think, because the deeper you look behind the curtain, the harder it gets to decide where the performance ends and where the damage begins.